If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. Firstly, thank you to all of those who have made some contributions. It's been really welcome and it will go a long way to help to keep the show going. Some people have been asking, what am I asking for donations for? Which is a fair question. It's basically for the hosting costs. Because I'm producing so many of the podcasts, the hosting costs, the bandwidth that I need to be able to host them all is going up. So if you can contribute in any way possible, then you can go to the GoFundMe page and search for the Sociology Show. And as I say, I do really appreciate all those that have made a contribution so far. And so on to today. My guest for this episode is Dr. Stephen Roberts from Monash University in Melbourne. Stephen is originally from the UK, but has been working in Australia for the last 5 years or so. Stephen's work focuses mainly on youths and youth culture, and also the idea of masculinity. And his new book, Youth Sociology, has just been released. And so without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Would you like to start by introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Steve Roberts, Associate Professor of Sociology at Monash University in Australia.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And judging by your accent, you're not Australian originally?
Definitely not. No, I've been here for 5 years. I originate from the UK. That's where I did all my studies and whatnot, and came here in 2015.
Brilliant, thank you. And what's your background in the subject of sociology, Stephen?
So I'm a sociologist of youth, essentially, but increasingly in the last 5 years, I've moved to the intersection of youth and masculinity studies as well. So I'm into youth transitions, but also, social change and masculinity and so on.
When did you start studying sociology yourself first? Did you do it at A level or something?
No, actually, if I can indulge myself for a minute, I'll tell the listeners a bit of my story, because I actually took the long route into sociology. So I didn't start studying it at all until I was at university, and that wasn't until I was 25. But I think what's been really great about the discipline for me, and that it's the discipline that most resonates with and helps me understand the circumstances of my upbringing, and in a way, helps me understand why it took me such a long time to go to university, I guess. And yeah, so if I can be a bit biographical, basically I was brought up on a working class council estate, and it was one of the very few mining villages in the southeast of England. And in that place, I was the eldest of 4 kids, brought up by my white mum, and I'm mixed race Indian and white British, but I was the only mixed race kid. My other 3 siblings are white. And my mum floated between being a single parent and then between that and in relationships with hostile, controlling and quite violent, very violent men. So and one of my brothers is profoundly disabled. So I don't say that for people to get, the world's smallest violin. It's more that I had a lot of observation and experience of different types of poverty, of stigma and masculinist violence. And, those experiences are very shape us, of course, but it probably wasn't until a lot further down the line that I was able to understand them, and that was a lot to do with sociology and the people I met through sociology. It wasn't like there was an absence of politics and thinking politically in my youth, actually, because I was aware of the politics of race a little bit because I was part Indian, but mostly because my mum, even though she was white, brought me up on the importance of the anti-apartheid movement, and I learned a lot about people like Stephen Biko and Nelson Mandela. but I was still super aware of classism as well, because I was brought up in a mining community, and I've got really strong memories of 1984 and the miners' strike. And I had an extended family who were miners and were into Marx kind of like verbally and discursively, but we didn't really read anything about, well, I certainly didn't read anything about Marx because books weren't really in my life. But anyways, yeah, so I had this kind of like working class upbringing, was exposed to violence and poverty and class stigma. And then I got lucky enough, and no small part because my mum was really helpful in pushing for me to try and go to a grammar school. And I say lucky in inverted commas because I didn't pass the Kent test actually, but my mum appealed and somehow got me through to grammar school. But my grammar school experience was pretty rubbish because I was a working class kid out of place, and got mocked for my accent a little bit, and basically didn't do very well. And I left school at 16, not allowed to stay on to do my A-levels because I didn't get the grades. So I went to a community college and did A-levels, and then I spectacularly failed my A-levels because I was more obsessed with getting some money from my part-time retail job. And then so from 16 to 24, I spent 8 years in the retail industry, mostly being a sales assistant, but then kind of working my way up to junior management roles. And then finally went to university at 25 and kind of sneaked in a backdoor route because I didn't have the A-levels. But what I did have was experience in a business at some sort of management level that for some reason the university gave me credit for. So they let me in. And then in the business school, I started doing wild modules in the School of Social Policy and Sociology in those two subjects. And that's where I really found this kind of like capacity to think sociologically, and was attracted to what sociology can do for me to think about my history and make sense of all those power dynamics that I'd kind of seen but never really understood beyond just being an individual.
That is a long journey to get there.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, it's really interesting because I was just putting together all the things that you mentioned. So your upbringing, you must have thought about class and masculinity and ethnicity. So I was just interested to know, you mentioned Marx, who else you were reading about, who inspired you whilst you were studying?
Yeah. So as I say, like my interest in race are kind of not so prominent in my writing and my thinking and my research since, but I've always been interested in race. And as I say, my kind of fascination with Stephen Biko, especially before Nelson Mandela, was really prominent for me. But I've been mostly interested in Marx, and then inspired by Pierre Bourdieu and people's reworking of Pierre Bourdieu, and that's still the case. But I think when I went to uni, like I was never a theory boy. Like I didn't really grasp sociological theory very well, and I was more interested in the kind of empirical application of theory. So, but mostly through people's work who were looking at working class people. So the ones that I remember being the kind of like real jolt moments of, wow, this is what it is to be a sociologist and think carefully about working class experience. Beverly Skeggs on working class women, and Diane Ray on the experience of working class people in education was really, really pivotal. And then a bit after that, Andy Furlong, the late Andy Furlong, who was a very pivotal figure in youth sociology, and I was lucky enough to have him as my PhD examiner. They're the kind of like real prominent people that made me think, like really attached to the discipline, more so than the big kind of theoreticians, I suppose.
Great. Thanks for saying Diane Ray, because I can plug the show that I did with her a few weeks ago. So if people haven't listened to that one, it's really popular, actually. It's one of the most popular ones I've done. But
I bet I can imagine why.
Exactly, yeah. I think people can understand why. Great, thanks, Stephen. So let's get into your own research. So what I thought we'd do in the first part is talk about some of the research you've done previously, and then in part two, your new book, which I know is very new, hot off the press. So let's start with previous work that you've done. What's your main area of research?
So yeah, my main area of research is youth sociology very broadly. And it's become a bit more diverse over the years. So I finished my PhD 10 years ago now. So I've done quite a bit, and I've been lucky enough to be in roles that give me a lot of space for research, actually. So I've done a fair few different kinds of projects, but my PhD project, and the first thing that I was writing about, and I think one of my very first publications, was about this concept of the missing middle in youth studies. And I guess because I'm principally interested in youth and social change, what I was kind of obsessed with in my PhD and just beyond that was this idea that the scholarly literature leaned towards a duality, which was either young people engage and they do their schooling and they do really well and they get professional careers and so on, or they drop out and they're disengaged and they end up being part of this underclass. And I was kind of obsessed with what I was thinking about as being, inverted commas, ordinary youth. And I kind of like was playing with this idea of a conceptual missing middle. And it wasn't like the most advanced theoretical thinking, but it was more of an empirical push for people to start looking at what happens. If we're going to get a proper understanding and in-depth understanding of youth as a social category, then we need to look at kind of like the great majority of people that like churn through school, they get on with it, and they have some sort of work and careers afterwards. It's not necessarily just these kind of polarized transitional directions, which I felt the youth literature was always kind of spoke to. So I felt there was a gap there, and that was the main kind of direction of travel for my early thinking.
You said the missing middle. What ages are we talking about? What is key in terms of where people go in one direction or the other?
Yeah, and actually, when I did my PhD, it was a time of change, of course, because around I finished in 2010, but around that time there was lots of changes to the school leaving age over the previous few years. So, in my thinking at the time, it was like probably at 18, but actually I'd kind of looked at people at being 16 when people take different routes as well, because certainly when I was growing up, you could leave school at 16, but by the time I finished my PhD, everyone had to be in some kind of training until they were, it was just about to be the case that everyone had to be in some kind of schooling or training until they were 18. So there's a pivotal kind of period. I thought that 18 to 24 was like 16 to 24 is the rough area of youth that a lot of people had looked at, and that I thought a lot of interesting things were happening in young people's lives, age 18 to 24. But increasingly, we think that's even extended even further. So the idea of youth is an extended category, if it's even a category at all. Some people might argue that adulthood is even a category we can make sense of anymore. But and some people will increasingly look at youth as being at least into young people's 30s now. But at the time that I was writing, I was kind of interested in what happens at 18 to 24, what for previous generations had been that threshold into adulthood.
Yeah, because people now often talk about a quarter life crisis, don't they? In the past, I suppose, early 20s people moved out of home, got married, started a family, whereas that's not necessarily the case now, right?
Yeah, that's it. Like it's still like it's these things are constrained in some ways by social forces. So we know that people in particular, like lower socioeconomic status or working class people, still move out more quickly on average, and they still end up in a couple of relationships more quickly. But there's definitely delayed compared to previous generations. So 18 to 24. There's a whole body of work referring to. It actually comes out of social psychology, but finds its way into sociology as well, about this concept of emerging adulthood. So like the 20s being this place that's like an extended experience of youth where people make choices and they can trial and make mistakes and all this kind of thing. And I'm not necessarily on board with that idea, but we definitely know that, the young people are not en masse leaving school at 16, 18, and then, leaving the family home within a year or so, like they may have done 40 years ago or something.
Yeah. And so you mentioned there's a difference in terms of social class. What other factors cause the difference in terms of which direction people go in at that age?
Yeah, there's a combination of things. So like there's the social norms, of course, like it's, we often point to how people follow the kind of trajectories set by other people in their class category, usually their parents and their wider family as well. So if it was, if we think back only a few decades really, when relatively few people were going to university, that the middle class is still middle class people go to university more than working class people. But the idea of that kind of extended period of education was for a relatively reserved few. And I think so. It's easy for us to make sense of working class life as being needing to get to work real quickly, and money being an issue because your mum and dad couldn't necessarily, or your parents or whomever couldn't necessarily look after you for an extended period of time. So when you reached the age at which you could work, you were supposed to go to work and start earning your wage, and then eventually make that track out into adulthood on your own. So there's those kind of social norms around that. And then more importantly, the opportunity structures. I think this is why it mostly changed. The opportunity structures there collapsed from the 1980s onwards. So the possibility for young people to take that track, to get a job that would then sustain a lifestyle, to set up home of their own, and or with a partner or whatever, with a family, were no longer there. So we get this kind of intersection of structural change and then people's attitudes changing at the same time. And sometimes that's flagged as, young people, they don't want to move out like they used to want to move out. I think it's, obviously sociology would say it's more complicated than that.
Yeah. And why do you think there is that kind of everything's being pushed back? People are getting married later, having children later, getting on the property ladder later. What do you think is the main reason why that's occurring?
Yeah, I think it's like, from a structural point of view, we can trace it back to what happened in the 80s with the collapse of the youth labour market. So, there is just the possibility for being the possibilities in being a young adult just aren't what they used to be. The chance to get a relatively well-paid job, even like relatively, again, I'm doing air quotes because like unskilled work, I'm not really comfortable with that idea. But the idea used to be that young people could leave school with relatively few qualifications, get unskilled work, and that would sustain those transitions. You'd be able to move out of the family home. But since the 1980s, that's been increasingly difficult because wages basically haven't grown very fast. There's been a growth of underemployment. There's been a growth of precarious work, and that kind of key economic kind of foundation that people need to be able to move out and then start a family and so on it's just not there. So it's not realizable. And then I think, but in combination, as that's happened, we get this sense of people also hedging their bets a little bit and thinking a bit more carefully about, trying stuff out, trying jobs out, being able to live with the family for longer because, in fact, the state support has been removed as well. So there's no choice. People either can move out, and if they can't, then they have to stay with their family, of origin. So I think there's a combination of things that have happened, and in part driven by neoliberal policy and economic change. And then there's a kind of corresponding change in attitudes that comes with it as well.
Yeah, that whole idea of a job for life has definitely changed, hasn't it? People fluctuate, move jobs every couple of years quite often.
Yeah, that's right. And that reference point where, it's probably not there for the contemporary generation of people who are at university. But if you go back one generation, they already wouldn't have been able to recognize the routes that their parents took as this, it's job for life. You come out of school, you leave the school gates and you go into the factory gates, and then that's it for 30 years or something. That's long gone. What the world is kind of, it's towards, we understand it as being moved towards a world that needs more navigating, and with lots of different terms and so on.
Because that's interesting what you said about what we define as youths, because if people are not getting married and not buying a house or still fluctuating around jobs or travelling all through their 20s, you could argue youth is into your late 20s, early 30s.
Definitely, yeah. And that's a lot of researchers do that now. In fact, a great group of researchers over here in Australia, they've got this idea of the new adulthood, and it's reflective of that rather than talk about people as being like delayed in their youth transition, they talk about how adulthood is not those markers that it used to be. And in fact, that if we think about the way we used to conceptualize youth as ending around the early 20s, because one would move out of the family home, get a job and get a partner. Those things happen much, much later, often into the 30s and well into the 30s. So our conceptualization of youth is messy now because it's just, there's no kind of like uniform movement of a big part of the cohort that all doing something at the same time.
I've got a confession here, Stephen. In Britain at the moment, they're showing Married at First Sight Australia.
Yeah.
That's really
unlucky for you.
Well, it's really interesting actually, because many of the people on there are mid-30s, late 30s. Lots of them still living at home. Lots of them haven't found the job that they want to do yet, or they certainly haven't found the relationship they want to yet. And in the past, they would have been considered over the hill, if you like. Yeah. That was a phrase that was used. But in my mind, watching it, they just still feel like youths.
Yeah, that's definitely. I mean, I don't know if Marriage at First Sight is reflective of a new norm, but they're the people that are on it are reflective of a relatively new norm, which is that people are taking their time to make choices, and like life is more fluid, so you don't have to make those commitments necessarily so early. But I think again, the sociological thinking always comes back in and thinks, for me, it reminds me to say, like, what's the possibility for that though? Like, are there possibilities to have nailed down a career type job by the time you're 25? And when actually, when you look at the data, we know that's not the case, because in Australia, there's it's a good few years now. People leave university and it's a good few years before they nail down a graduate type job. And that's a big change as well.
Yeah. And you mentioned masculinity, how does masculinity segue into your research on youth culture?
Yeah, so it's a funny thing. Like, I ended up like falling over masculinity in some ways because I didn't think about it at all in my PhD research, which is kind of absurd, because actually my research was about working class men. It was actually about men who were working in the service sector in the UK who they didn't fall into this dichotomy of being underperformers or disengaged from school, and they weren't super successful. And I didn't really think about them as being men at all until after my PhD, and it came to me because I was at a conference listening to someone talk about something, and I thought, some ideas that translate into what's happening here, so I should pursue that line of inquiry. So eventually I started to think about what it is to be a working class man, and the potential for transformation of masculinity because of the roles that people were taking in the economy. So it was previously theorized that young working class men hated working in the service sector because it was at odds with working class masculinity. And then a couple of years out of my PhD, I realized that wasn't the case. I was thinking, what's going on? Like, more and more young men are working in these jobs that they used to be described as being antithetical to working class masculinity. So that was my kind of like segue into that type of thinking. And then increasingly, I was interested in all things masculinity from there.
Right. Thank you, Stephen. That's going to be the end of part one. In part two, we'll talk more about your research. Hi, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Stephen Roberts. Stephen, carry on telling us a little bit more about that idea on masculinity that you mentioned in part one.
Yeah, so my research increasingly focused, I started thinking about youth and youth transitions, and then increasingly thinking about men and masculinity, because my research subjects were actually men, and I hadn't necessarily considered them in relation to masculinity, which, as I mentioned before, seemed a bit absurd. But so I actually revisited as many of the men as I could for my PhD. So it became a longitudinal study of sorts, and I touched base with them again another couple of times. First one in 2012, I think, or 13, and then again in 2016. So I talked to these men over 7 years, actually. So I've got a good sense of like the way their trajectories have mapped out in their early 20s. And what I was really keen to do, this culminated in my 2018 book, Young Working Class Men in Transition. And what I was really keen to do with that book was demonstrate or document the way that young working class men's lives had changed, especially in the economic sphere, but the implications of that as well. And I think what I really tried to do was to disrupt this stereotype of the young working class man as being automatically problematic, like automatically being homophobic and sexist and rejecting of all things feminine. Like that was the real message of my book. And it wasn't about like saying hashtag not all men. It was like saying, there's still lots of things wrong with masculinity, but it's not about being working class that leads people to crime and aggression and other forms of sexism. That's something to do with masculinity per se, but not necessarily something to do with working classness, which I was kind of really trying to trouble.
Because one of the arguments sociologists have come up with is this idea of crisis of masculinity. So because we lost a lot of the jobs to do with factories and mining and manual work and so on as we move more into the service sector, that a lot of men have become disillusioned, with their identity. Was that anything that you found in your own research?
Yeah, it's definitely an idea that I've been concerned with and thought about a lot. And there'll be plenty of other people who I'm sure may or may not have been on this show and might be in the future, but people like Michael Ward and Nicola Ingram in the UK also talk about this kind of stuff. And the key feature of the crisis of masculinity as a rhetoric is that it comes around, like it's been around for a long time. It's been around since the beginning of the 1900s, and every decade or so we see new iterations of it. So we have to, call it out a little bit. And I think it's a go-to language. It's a go-to set of words that helps people think through problems. So some people say, well, masculinity, as we can see through the ages, is inherently in crisis. It's always unstable in some sense. And definitely every decade teaches us as a new set of reasons about why men are feeling at odds with their masculinity or whatever. And I think the kind of bottom line with that is that it's not an effective way of thinking through young men's lives. And it feels a bit like a discursive distraction, I suppose, because it's not actually that young people's lives young men's lives are in crisis. It's that perhaps masculinity is changing. And I think this idea that young men principally can't change and don't change and like always hark back to the glory days of masculinity is somewhat simplistic.
I can't remember the writer, so I do apologise, but someone mentioned that working class men in the past, they would kind of take out their frustrations and anger in quite a manual job, or something being physical, and now they're stuck in call centres.
The number one writer in that area from the 1970s was Paul Willis, who wrote a book about why working class boys get working class. Well, it was called Why Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs, Learning to Labour. But the key there, I think, is that life isn't necessarily the same, and I think the frustrations around working in a call centre are legitimate, but actually they're very similar to what Willis was saying. Like sometimes my view is, at least, that saying that people had a better time in the factories compared to what they do in the call center is missing the point a little bit. People were still, victims of capitalism in the same way, and they took out their frustrations at work in the factories in similar ways. You see the studies about working class people working in call centers also finding ways to take out the frustration. So the kind of resistance to the relations of capitalism are present over the decades. And again, I think that's something misleading potentially about saying, oh yeah, like in the 70s, all the men loved working in factories and it was all easy. When actually Willis's book was all about the way they resisted their bosses. They created shop floor humor as a mechanism for getting through the day. Like, it wasn't the glory days compared to now.
And why males? Why do you think it impacts them so much more than females in terms of identity, work, and so on?
I think, like, in that sense, there's definitely been a change. Like, we know that lots of working class women have always been in the economy for over 100 years in various ways, but that's still been a very relatively small proportion compared to the number of men. So when people look at economic change, it does seem to affect men more so, because heavy industry and those occupations that were more masculinist and men basically worked in have disintegrated or disappeared completely. So the attention to what men are doing instead is a really striking social change. And I think that's why it's of interest. We want to see if and how men are adapting to these changes. But that's only like one part of it. Like, some men, older men now, have experienced going through that change. But young men now, especially like right now, the 20 to 25-year-olds of today, they didn't experience working in factories and mines and so on. Are very unlikely to have, and then had a change. And in fact, this is one of the driving themes of my book. It's all they know. Like, working in shops and service sector roles is not so at odds with their sense of identity, because there is no other option. So they know the stories of their parents and the men before them that worked in the mines and the factories and so on. But the possibilities for that today are not real. So young people, I think, locate their possibilities in what's possible, not harking back to some imagined past and wishing they were in a factory.
Yeah. And you just mentioned young people today, 2025. That brings us neatly onto your most recent book, your new book.
Yeah.
How's today? You got it today, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, literally just arrived before we started the podcast, so that's good. I'm glad to have it, because there was rumours that it wouldn't get to this part of the world, so it's nice to have a hard copy. I just hope my library can pick it up in time to run it for my course, which starts in about 2 weeks.
Right. So tell us all about it. It's called Youth Sociology, yeah?
Yeah, so it's Youth Sociology. I'm showing it to the screen, even though no one will see this. And it's co-authored with a bunch of my colleagues over this part of the world. And it's a textbook. It's a bringing together of the field, and it introduces youth sociology as a series of live debates. And I think what's really important about this part of the discipline, and I guess that's a discipline as a whole, but certainly my discipline is my part of the subdiscipline, is that youth sociology is a low consensus discipline, right? There's lots of arguments, and I'm at the forefront of some of those arguments and contestations and theoretical debates that we have. And this book kind of brings those to the table, and I think doesn't shy away from them, as well as bringing together decades worth of different types of important literature across domains such as young people's experience in education, in work, in terms of their cultural lives and cultural identities, young people's health, their political engagement and their sense of belonging across a whole range of domains. So it really is very much a a kind of something for everyone type of book, and I'm hopeful that it'll be really useful for undergraduate students and beyond as a primer for the field. Like, it's a bringing together, it's a desk-based research book, so it's a summary really of the field in lots of different ways, and it's more about an introduction to the debates in the field and the core literature and the key readings, but as well as being reflecting on even those super influential people who were, well, the people that were super influential writers for me, were all kind of like, they were white, basically. They're white British or white American people. And I think what the Youth Sociology book is bringing in more diverse set of voices. So every chapter is now filled with more than kind of lip service to the discussions that happen in, so for example, in youth cultures, rather than just think about the working class youth cultures of the 1970s that everyone always writes and reads about. That stuff's in there, but we also talk about youth cultures in Japan and hip hop in Iran and well beyond. So I think this book is, it brings together the key issues in youth sociology as a set of live debates, but also brings to attention different parts of the world and different dynamics, like indigenous people's experience of youth and how that contrasts to young people who are white and part of the colonizer class, I suppose. So there's a whole series of different things that go on in the book, but I think it's hopefully a very useful introduction for undergraduates, postgraduates, and beyond. That's a good reference point.
And do you mind telling us a little bit about how you gathered the research? So firstly, kind of what research methods you used, and then whereabouts the stories of the youths take place as well.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay. So this book is all desk based. So this is like a youth sociology primer textbook, I guess. But if we want to quickly talk about methods, I'm probably better off talking about my 2018 book. So I had another book at the end of last year, which is maybe interesting as well. But my 2018 book was on young working class men's transitions, was longitudinal qualitative. So it was predominantly qualitative interviews for the first round, but also with a little bit of observation involved as well, like going to people's workplace and so on, but mostly biographical interviews. But I guess where it got more interesting was in the second and third iteration of the interviews, like several years on, where I ended up, especially because I was at the other side of the world by 2015 for the third interview. So I started engaging in what at the time were relatively new modes of method. So communicating via WhatsApp and Facebook and like other, so asynchronous methods, where I'd sometimes send a message and I'd wait for them to send back. And sometimes we'd set up interviews like this, but over the phone. But sometimes we'd interview in text, so it would be properly asynchronous. So we'd ask questions and have this like long drawn out conversation that was still updating around interesting parts of the young men's lives at two different points beyond the first interview. And then in addition to that, I engaged with a proportion of them who agreed, I engaged in a kind of like a Facebook ethnography, I guess. So this was thinking about the way that they described their lives through their qualitative interviews was replicated or otherwise in their interactions with people online. So seeing these discussions of, in my qualitative data, in the interviews, people were talking about, not all the time, but oftentimes a kind of a commitment to a fairer division of domestic labour and being with their children that I probably didn't necessarily expect, especially from what I'd read myself in previous years. But I was able to kind of triangulate some of that through, it's still discursive and perhaps it's still performative in a way, but to at least see the kind of presentation of self that occurs in Facebook and the connection and emotionality that they had with other men, but also with and about their children. So like often documenting when these men were with their kids on their own and being very involved, I suppose, like this kind of notion of involved fatherhood is often seen as being a very middle class thing. Well, actually my research kind of unpacked that this was a thing that working class men did as well, but they didn't necessarily talk about it in the same ways, but they did get on with it. And similarly with respect to their other parts of divisions of domestic labour. So there's a bunch of American research as well that kind of replicates this and says, in fact, was the foundation for my thinking here, that says that working class men live egalitarianism, but they don't talk about it. But middle class men talk about egalitarianism, but don't necessarily live it because they outsource domestic labour to domestic servants, essentially.
That's interesting, because that would kind of counter what some research is saying. Some research is saying that in dual income families that actually the female's still predominantly doing the majority of the emotional and domestic labour. So are you saying that actually it's a bit more equal, even though perhaps it's not discussed?
Yeah, so there's no question that the gap is closing, but it's still a huge gap. And so women, without question, do more of the housework and other domestic labour and look after the children more. And then there's a qualitative gap as well. So there are different types of activities that men are more likely to do and different types of activities that women are likely to do. And the ones that women do are more often constrained in terms of the time they have to do it. So there's definitely an issue with gender. I think that the core argument in this particular chapter of the book that I'm thinking about is that the literature often assumes that working class men are less likely than their middle class counterparts to be involved in their kids' lives and to chip in with domestic labour. But actually, there's a smaller body of work that talks about how working class men, and I think my work speaks to this as well, working class men and women and working class couples essentially have done more of that sharing because there's this notion where one comes home and looks after the kid when the next one goes to their shift. So the economic pressures of being a working class household lend themselves more readily than is often discussed to a slightly fairer distribution of labour. And I absolutely take your point. I don't want to say that it's all rosy because it's not, but I think the key is that we shouldn't think of working class men as being, the people who are layabouts when it comes to finishing their work and not engaging with the tasks of looking after their children and contributing to domestic labour as well. Like it's not a middle class privileged angle, which is just these middle class privileged men are looking after those aspects of their life as well.
That's interesting. So your research has shown that men would like more time with their children and more time at home as well?
Yeah. And I think that reflects a lot of other research. Again, of course, as sociologists, I think we have to be super careful about what's the way people talk versus the way people act. Those two things aren't necessarily interchangeable. But certainly again, if we go back just a little while, we would find that working class men, or at least working class men, were situated as not in a way where they would never say, I want to work, I want to look after my kids, and I want to do the housework, and I want to be fairer. And in fact, that very notion, like that discussion, would have been an affront to masculinity. So where we are now is that at the very least, people are talking in ways that makes them seem more progressive on that front. Now, of course, the big tension is whether or not those words are translated into reality. And what we then see is when research talks to women say, actually, partner might talk a good game, but they don't actually pull their weight in.
The reason I asked that question is I'm just wondering with the pandemic whether this is going to shake things up a little bit. We've had a lot more people working from home, time away from the office or wherever it might be. Anecdotally, a lot of my male friends have said they've enjoyed being at home, they've enjoyed seeing the children more, and actually starting to reevaluate their work-life balance as well. Do you think that could shake things up a little bit?
Yeah, I really hope so. We've been thinking about, I'm sure a lot of sociologists have been thinking about this as well, but the early data, because some people have responded very quickly to this, the early data seems to suggest that's not the case. So I also hear anecdotally all kinds of possibilities for transformation around masculinity in terms of what that kind of nexus of work and home, but also the possibilities for reaching out and being more emotional with other men, because we all realize we're in this kind of survival mode and we don't have to just hold back our emotions anymore. But in terms of housework, actually, the emerging work still suggests that even though men are probably doing more, like the burden has actually fallen harder on women. So women's working hours have cut back, whereas men's working hours haven't necessarily cut back. So they might be doing more around the house to contribute to that domestic labour load, but women are sacrificing more as well. So I think that's an important part of this conversation. That doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't be hopeful that gender can be reimagined in this kind of situation. It just means that we can't get too excited that it's been this complete transformation when actually, women are still burdened.
Yeah, it worries me. We quite often hear the expression about getting back to normal. I just think now's the time to reevaluate rather than go back to set normal.
Yeah, for sure. And I hear that in lots of different contexts as well, even at universities and stuff. At my place of work, people often talk about Like, why do we need to go back to normal? What was so special about normal? Let's think about what we need and what we want and what could be the new normal. And I think that applies to gender as well. And I think, like, again, it's anecdotal, but even thinking about my own home life, like, I'm relatively egalitarian and like on equal terms in terms of our housework and child minding and stuff, looking after our child at home. But I still think this has given me a possibility to reshape my work-life balance as well. So, like, I think there's productive possibilities, but I don't want to get too excited.
It will be very interesting to see where we are in 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, and so on in the future. And before we leave, do you mind telling people how they can get in contact?
Okay, yeah. I'm on Twitter at SteveRoberts_, and I'm very happy to receive messages and chat to people on there. And am I allowed to give my email, or do we not do that kind of stuff? Yeah. So I'm Stephen with a V .d.roberts@monash.edu. I'm very happy to talk to prospective PhD students, especially, but anybody that wants to talk about sociology. I'm always super keen.
Right, and I assume we can get your books this side of the world?
You definitely can, yeah. Most of the publishers we work with are UK based, so you can definitely get the books there. And please buy them.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you very much for your time today, Stephen. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.